Welcome back, everybody. We're here for the last presentation of today. And while preparing this introduction, I thought, how can I make this introduction less long than the lecture he will hold for us? I'd give it a try, but it doesn't fit everything. But it shows how much Chris Rainier has been doing in his professional career and his life. Chris Rainier is the Director of Cultural Sanctuaries Foundation, global program focused on preserving both biodiversity, cultural heritage. The mission of the foundation is by protecting traditional cultures on their land, they can better protect biodiversity and wilderness, which is on the front line of climate change. Photography plays a crucial role in empowering traditional societies, creating opportunities for indigenous communities to tell the story of climate issues firsthand. During his continued tenure with the National Geographic Society, Rainier has been the co-founder and co-director of both the Enduring Voices Language Project and director of the All Roads Photography Program, designed to support indigenous groups with modern technology, desiring to document their traditional culture and create sustainable solutions to preserve the planet in the 21st century. His book has been widely shown, collected by museums around the world. He's been featured in 2 documentaries and Under Fire by National Geographic Channel, Iraq Under Fire by National Geographic Channel, and Ancient Tattoos by Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and Smithsonian TV Channel. Rainier has 6 books published. He lectures throughout the world on traditional culture and climate adaptation, traditional knowledge systems, and on using modern technology to preserve ancient cultural traditions. He's here for you today. Chris Rainier, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everybody, and I know it's been a long day, but it's a great honor and pleasure to be here and see new friends and some associates. What I'd like to do today is just have you sit, relax. I'm going to bring up a magic carpet, invite you on, and take you around the world to places like New Guinea, where man still has 1 foot in the Garden of Eden, to places like the Sahara Desert. I'm fascinated with culture. I'm fascinated with traditional culture. My journey into photography and culture really began back in the 1980s in the southwest desert of the United States, a place called the Four Corners. New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, and Arizona come together. And what I found in that area was remnants of ancient cultures, civilizations 10, 15, 20,000 years old, leaving their mark on the land, their spiritual connection to the land. And really that was the beginning of the process for me to want to explore traditional societies around the world. At that time, I was working for Ansel Adams. I mentioned this the other day. I was his last photographic assistant. And one of the great privileges was to spend 5 years proofing all of his 60,000 negatives. And I decided to begin with his very first negative. And what I really began to understand was the power of photography, and indeed his photography, as an art form, yet he used it as a social tool. And eventually, when I left the Ansel Adams studio, I worked to combine that sense of art, yet always knowing that photography for me needed to serve as a social tool. So once I finished at the Ansel Adams studio, I really began a journey that hasn't ended. I left in 1985, and one of the first places I decided to go to was an island that I had heard about. I grew up partly in Australia. My father had a job there at that time, and he would take me as a young lad out into the Aborigine communities where I really understood the power of traditional culture. But he had talked about this island to the north of Australia, New Guinea. And ever since being a young lad, I had wanted to go there. I wanted to step back into time, if you will, and journey into the Stone Age. New Guinea is this remarkable island that has, as I mentioned the other day, over 1,000 languages, not dialects, languages, extremely isolated communities. I ended up spending 10 years living in New Guinea for half of the year, and eventually I decided to do a project and document the remaining Stone Age tribes in New Guinea, often traveling by dugout canoe for months on end, or renting a Cessna and taking a one-way trip up into the highlands of New Guinea. I was on one of the expeditions. I would often put together 2 to 3 month expeditions hiking into the valleys, and this woman we ran across up in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. And I was with an anthropologist, and we interviewed the woman. She had this beautiful shell on her chest, and yet she was 500 miles from the coast. Ended up discovering that this shell had been traded from valley to valley to valley, and you could see by the dots across the top, it had been traded over some 300 years. New Guinea is a place where there are rituals of birth and death and the afterlife, marriage and war. It is a place where you see really the traditions of the essence of life so much. And so at that time I was shooting a lot in color and in black and white, and I love the juxtaposition between the two. Obviously, being mentored by Ansel Adams, I see the power of photography and the power of the black and white image. And for me, black and white is not just simply lacking color, it actually speaks of emotions that are very spiritual, very primordial. And yet I also love the palette of color. One day I was walking along a trail, and I would often work with translators, because literally, as I mentioned, you could go from valley to valley and there'd be a completely different language. And we were heading up into the highlands, and we ran across this remarkable older gentleman with the birds of paradise feathers. And I did a very Western thing through my translator, because he was looking at this tree, and the tree was full of birds. And I said, "How many birds are up in the tree?" He talked to the old man, they talked in their traditional tongue, and then a few minutes later, in an embarrassed tone, my guide said, "We don't have words for numbers." And I immediately kind of did a reaction of like, well, this must be a very primitive culture. And then I stopped myself and I realized that if I was to understand this culture, I had to learn to ask the right questions. We tend to be very ethnocentric. We look at the other and frame it based upon our conditions, our understanding of the world. And I knew if I was to go further into the forest, I really had to understand, reserve judgment, and think through that there are many different ways of seeing the world. There are many different realities, especially within traditional culture. New Guinea is where I fell in love with the idea of masks and rituals, and so much of that work that I did was around documenting traditional mask rituals and what they call in New Guinea these remarkable gatherings, these sing-sings, where they get together and celebrate life and honor life as much as possible. This is in the Muprik area, along the Sepik, the middle Sepik, and this is a festival where they worship the yams. And so many of these masks are around being the conduit between the earthly world and the celestial world. And so eventually I'll talk about the MASP project that took me around the world for close to 30 years. Now, I mentioned this gentleman, this old man, the other day, but I'll tell the story very quickly. I had heard about this ritual that was unfolding, this initiation process for this young boy, and I had hiked into this village. We established that they had never had contact with the outside world, and I sat down after arriving in this village, and this old man came up to me and through the translator said, "Which valley are you from?" And I smiled and I said, "Many, many valleys away." And he kept asking, "No, which valley are you from?" And then eventually he answered the question. "I know you're from where the green meets the blue." He had never been out of his valley, but he had heard this mythical story of where the forest ended and the ocean began. And I wrote that down in my journal, and indeed, I feel now, some 20, 25 years later, that we're all from where the green meets the blue. I was recently, a couple years ago, doing a TED Talk, and there was a female astronaut who had just come down from the space station. I gave my lecture, then she gave her lecture, and she ran up to me afterwards and said, "You know, you're right. When I used to sit up there in that space station, I'd look at the Earth, the green and the blue, I'd look out into the infinity of space," and then she realized how small and fragile this island, if you will, that we live on, the Earth Island, where the green meets the blue is. And it needs help, and we need to pay attention to that. I had the opportunity and the desire to photograph a battle. And often in New Guinea, there are battles. There are reasons why they have battles. It's usually over land disagreements or stealing pigs or wildlife. And so these two tribes had agreed to disagree and have a battle. And it was interesting because at that time I was doing a lot of work for Time magazine, and just before I went in, Time telexed me at that time and said, "Could you in 6 weeks go to Sarajevo and replace a photographer that was coming out?" So I agreed to do that, and then I began this hike into where I knew this battle was going to happen. And it went on for 3 or 4 days. I had a chance to photograph it. Eventually someone was killed. The compensation was over. I journeyed out, got on a plane to Sarajevo, and I arrived in Sarajevo at some of the worst fighting during the Bosnian War. And about a week after, I was sitting on this top of the hotel, the Holiday Inn. If any of you worked in Sarajevo as photojournalists, you would know this hotel very well. And the tracers were bouncing around, and I thought, you know, it's a conceit that we think we've evolved from the Stone Age to a sophisticated culture. The only thing we've done is created more sophisticated ways to kill ourselves. And that was a very powerful moment for me. I would often journey to very isolated areas. I had heard about the Michael Rockefeller story. Some of you may know that, where he disappeared in the early 60s. I was fascinated with the story, so I went into where he disappeared, and these in the Asmat area are very warlike people. This is one afternoon going out in their war canoes as they were practicing. So my philosophy is that I want to stay long enough in an area. I don't want to just parachute in and spend a day or so. I'll often go in and spend several weeks, sometimes months. And this again is in the Asmat area, where they take the skulls of respected elders and they mummify the bodies, they dry them out, and then once the body is dried out, they take the skull and sort of ritualize it with all of this particular decoration. I was hiking up in the highlands of Irian Jaya, out of the Balim Valley, And I had heard about this village where once a respected elder passes away, they mummify the body. So we arrived into the village late in the afternoon, and through my escort and my guide, we gained permission to be able to sleep there that night. But however, I think the chief of the village had a very warped sense of humor. The only place I was allowed to sleep was in the hut where they kept the mummified elder. So you can imagine all night I was terrified with this mummified elder sitting over in the corner of the room. They, as much as life, believe in the afterlife. They believe that they are reincarnated over and over again. And so they worship the dead and they honor the dead. This particular woman's husband has passed away. She is not allowed to be seen, and her eyes are not allowed to be seen. And those are the two brothers. The most interesting aspect here is that necklace, that rattan necklace, is the symbolic connection to the spirit of that person who has passed away. It is only after that necklace, if you will, rots away several months later, is the spirit free to go into the afterworld. This is out on New Britain, the Malagan masks, very famous masks. Once again, someone has passed away. These are the shamans, the elders in the village, being, if you will, baptized in the water, cleansed in the water. And this is a death ritual. Once they have done that, they then wander around the village kind of blessing people. So often these rituals are about the connection to the afterworld, and again, the masks. After several years working, a particular guide that I had passed away from cerebral malaria, and we took his body back to his village, and in that particular village, what they do is they build a spirit canoe, a symbolic canoe with the totems of the clan, his village, his family, and at sunset they push the spirit canoe into the afterworld. I mentioned this the other day as well. I was in the village that had never seen white people before. We had finished our documentary. We had spent several weeks there photographing, making connections with the people. And on the very last day, and it was up on the top of a very isolated mountain, on the very last day, I was packed, ready to go. A beautiful sunny afternoon, and suddenly this thunderstorm rolled up the valley. They got out their fashionable raincoats, banana leaf raincoats, and then the storm cleared, and I was sitting there, sun going down, remarkable experience of all these children playing around at my feet, and I looked up into the sky, and some 30,000 feet above me was a jet on its way probably from Australia to Asia. And at that very moment, it struck me, what a remarkable experience to be here. And we have all of this technology, the planes that fly around the world, we put a man on the moon, the internet, and yet there are still these cultures living on the frayed edge of our maps with one foot in the Garden of Eden. And this is such a precious moment now. I mentioned the other day there's 6,000 languages, 80% of them are indigenous, 80% are oral, and yet we're losing all of this traditional knowledge, all of these cultures at such a rapid fashion. And that is really where I've committed my life, to put on film cultures that are from our primordial past, living in the present for future generations. Joel mentioned Edward Curtis, and I have always admired what Edward Curtis did in the American West with the Native American cultures. in the early part of the 20th century. It's because of those images that not only do we have a glimpse into a culture that has changed so rapidly, but so many traditional cultures, so many of the Native American tribes appreciate those images and actually reference those images as the reason they know how to do the sun dance. It's the way they can go back in time, understand what they've lost, and be able to revitalize and re-energize their culture. Once I left New Guinea, I headed for India, specifically Varanasi, one of the oldest cities in India. And I spent about 6 weeks living in Varanasi, going down to the Ganges every day. India is this remarkable country full of such rich rituals and as well mask rituals. And so I mentioned this book, Masks. I've spent 30 years documenting mask rituals around the world, and India, again, is one of the epicenters of particular mask rituals, very specifically in Kerala, in the southern part of India. And what I think I love about India is that it is so rich, so modern, on the cutting edge of technology, and so many things that we work with in the 21st century, and yet it is deeply, deeply steeped in these ancient traditions and ancient rituals. Was photographing this particular mask dance at night. He's got this costume that at any moment could just burst into flames, and he kept running towards me, and I thought for sure I was going to go up in flames with him. So the mask project, I spent about 20 years and really kind of dove into trying to understand what so many of these rituals are about. And for me, it is a kind of race against time, because so many of these traditions are disappearing and disappearing very quickly. So for me, it is, in a way, like the photo arc. It is an archive that will be able to exist into the future for future generations. And part of the project that I worked at in National Geographic and now continue under our Cultural Sanctuaries Foundation is to bring technology, where invited, to societies that want to tell their stories. And one particular project we worked on was in Mustang in Nepal, where a group of monks wanted to have access to technology, wanted to have training in video and still photography. And we worked on this project, gave them the cameras, and it allowed them to be able to document some of the traditions that were quickly disappearing, like these mask rituals. There's a photograph coming up of a particular old monk that was the sole survivor of the ability to create these masks, and it was through bringing these cameras that they had the opportunity to be able to document it and keep the tradition alive. And I find so many different places around the world that they are eager for the technology. And it doesn't mean that if you bring in technology, you are immediately replacing their traditional culture. In fact, many traditional cultures are embracing the technology, embracing the internet that allows them to empower, to educate, and to be able to archive many of their traditions. So this is up in the Mustang area, as well as Bhutan, and up onto the Tibetan Plateau. I've been going to these areas for the last 25 years and documenting. And this is the gentleman I was mentioning, an old monk that has since passed away, but had the tradition of the mask rituals. I like, again, as I mentioned, to work both in black and white and color, and certainly pre-digital. I would often have a black and white camera and a color camera separately and just shoot everything on both cameras. Now working with digital And often working with a Hasselblad, a square format, of course, I can make a file in black and white, I can make a file in color, and then decide afterwards what I want. Now, the wonderful thing about photography is, for me, it's a passport. It gives me the opportunity to travel around the world, to continue to be educated, and it also allows you to see things in a very different way. This image is from Tibet. That is a swastika. The Hindu word for this symbol is swastika, and yet it's so charged in the West in the 20th and 21st century. In fact, it is the circle of life. It is the Buddhist, Hindu circle of life, and in fact, many indigenous cultures use this symbol. And you'll see the 4 dots, the 4 elements, earth, wind, fire, sky, and it is the circle of life. And again, that's what I love about photography. It takes me to places, and I need, as I mentioned before, to stop and begin to learn and understand other cultures and the way they look at the world very differently. Traveling out of the Tibetan plateau, you end up in Mongolia. Mongolia is a remarkable country, and our foundation has been working there and working with a number of different cultures. And I'm also fascinated with this kind of universality of symbolism. The standing stones here are very similar to the standing stones you have in Stonehenge in different parts of Europe and Scotland. This is approximately 12,000 years old, and these are the tombstones of these particular hunters in the northern Mongolia area that would pass away, and then they would take this kind of symbolic deer up into the afterworld. Mongolia having come out of the Russian Empire, is very interesting because it's Buddhist, and yet also they believe in shamanism. So part of the documentation I was doing in Mongolia was the shamanistic rituals. And it is, in a way, where shamanism began. As we walked out of Africa, as we spread across the European continent and ended up on our way to Siberia and across the land bridge into Alaska, shamanism really began in Mongolia, and it is still in existence. So you'll often see contemporary Mongolians living in the city that are Buddhists, but they're also going to see the shaman for a blessing. This is out in Western Mongolia. We're working on a project with the Eagle Hunters out there. And what's remarkable, and I often smile when I think about this, is you can go to these incredibly isolated areas. We were 5 days off the road. There was no electricity. This particular group of nomadic eagle hunters had a generator for electricity. And I scouted this photograph. We went up on the hill, had fantastic, handsome eagle hunter. And as I often do, is I took a shot with my iPad to show him what I was visualizing. He looked at the photograph through the translator, he smiled and he said, "Whoa, I'd love a copy of that image." And so I took out my pen and piece of paper and was about to write down whatever way we could get the image back to him. And he went, no. He whipped out his smartphone and he said, "Just airdrop it over and I'll put it on Facebook." And that's the world we live in, and why not? Why should we hold the exclusive right to have access to all this technology? You can go into the deepest parts of New Guinea or West Africa and people are using smartphones, people are accessing information. And that's a part of what we're doing with the Cultural Sanctuaries Foundation, is we're invited, bringing in that technology, allowing people to access information from around the world. One of the main programs that my co-partner Wade Davis and I ran at the National Geographic for many years was connecting two indigenous cultures where they had highly endangered language and cultural knowledge, and connecting them to the technology. So they had the ability to tell their own stories, but also share it with other indigenous groups. We set up this kind of global web that was sponsored by Google to be able to connect indigenous cultures around the world and allow them to share the stories of what it means to be unique and cultural. This is the shamans, again, in Mongolia. This is a particularly sacred site for shamans up in northern Mongolia. You'll notice it's kind of like a teepee. The Mongolian word for teepee is the same as the Navajo word for teepee. So you can clearly see the arc of the tradition of language that has worked its way across the land bridge into the United States. So often trying to work with my models, I think because of the background that I had with Ansel Adams, I'm visualizing a landscape, I'm visualizing the background, and placing someone into that or allowing it to unfold. And for me, the environment, the clouds, the particular light that is taking place behind them is as important as the model itself. Further on up from Siberia, this is an ancient Inuit site right on the Russian far northeast point of Russia before you end up crossing over to Alaska. It's an ancient Inuit site, as I mentioned, and they would often put up the whale bones and then put skins over it and have their rituals inside. Coming further down to Japan, I've worked a lot in Japan. I did a project called Ancient Marks, which was following the flow of ink around the world, traditional tattooing. And no question, one of the probably most remarkable examples of traditional tattooing is with the Japanese Yakuza, the mafia. And so this is in Kyoto in one of the sacred rock gardens. I didn't even try and get permission to be able to photograph the mafia in this particular sacred rock garden. So I had the gentleman come in. He had a tracksuit. We were surrounded by monks. They were wondering what we were doing. I knew I had maybe 30 seconds to be able to photograph him before we were kicked out, so had the place marked. I had my assistant holding the flash. He took his robe off, his tracksuit, sat down. I got off 2 or 3 frames before we were kicked out, but at least I had an opportunity to get the image. Also, with the mask rituals, photographing the samurai tradition. Took me probably about 5 years to get permission to be able to photograph some of these remarkable samurai costumes. Come to find out, in Japan, very wealthy, tends to be older male, Japanese, love to be able to have these costumes built in their name and their honor of their particular family. So there's one particular family that has been creating these samurai masks ever since the samurai tradition, 200 to 300 years old, and of course getting permission to be able to photograph them. And then there are models that are only specifically allowed to wear these costumes. So I had a chance to be able to connect with a number of these costumes and kind of continuing to do that project as well. This is up in Hokkaido, the Ainu, and the Ainu are the only indigenous group that has survived in Japan on the very isolated northern islands of Hokkaido, and only just recently been recognized by the Japanese government as a traditional culture. And so I was invited to come over and spend several weeks photographing a lot of their elders and their particular regalia and costumes. And what I saw is that they had built a cultural community center there, and I was invited to come in, spend time with the elders, and what I saw was by the physicality of this building that the culture was getting revitalized, that they could come together, they could bring in the young children, they could have the elders, and they could share stories. And for me, that was a real light bulb moment, and one of the key important factors of our cultural sanctuary work is creating cultural centers, these gathering spots where people can come together within the community and to be able to share stories and be able to document the language from the elders. And it's crucial to a culture to have these community centers. Beautiful regalia, absolutely amazing costumes. So, Cambodia, it's a place that I've been going since the mid-1980s. Angkor Wat is specifically one of the most remarkable places. Just recently went back just prior to COVID and found this ancient temple. It's about 5 hours north of Angkor Wat. And also during the tattoo project, Ancient Marks was also photographing a lot of the monks. So in this area between Thailand, Laos, and Cambodia, many of the monks are tattooed with these very religious symbols. So this is the Bayon Temple in Angkor Wat. This gentleman is the sole surviving monk who survived the onslaught of the Khmer Rouge when they came through in the 1970s. They slaughtered all the other monks, and he's single-handedly brought back the kind of Buddhist tradition in and around Angkor Wat. So a number of you have been to Angkor Wat and Cambodia. It is truly a remarkable place. I invite everybody else to go there and see this amazing, amazing spot that is lingering out in the tropical jungles of Southeast Asia. Tattooing, probably one of the epicenters of tattooing is the South Pacific, the area that ranges from the Marshall Islands, Palau, all the way over to Hawaii, to Easter Island, and then to New Zealand. And this is a Maori, and this is down in the Milford Sound, the region that he is from. And what I love about the tattooing is this is his traditional mocha, so this is his family emblem, and yet tattooed into his forehead is a Christian cross. And so, like so many traditional indigenous cultures living in the 21st century, they are caught between two worlds, their own spiritual beliefs, their own unique religion, if you will, and yet Christianity. And in a way, we're caught in that same dilemma of science and yet our own personal beliefs of spiritualism. And it's a combination of both of those. And this is his mocha. Spent a lot of time throughout the South Pacific documenting the tattooing, and what is fascinating is that back in the 1700s, when Captain Cook came through, many of his sailors were tatad. The actual Polynesian word for tattooing is tata, T-A-T-A-U, and that is the sound of the wooden instrument tattooing onto the body. Captain Cook's sailors got tattooed, took it back to England and Europe, and that is how tattooing got reintroduced into contemporary European culture, and it's really kind of stayed there, and of course in the last 20 years expanded. One of my favorite things to do is to go to PowerPoints, sacred places around the world. And I've spent the last 30 years documenting sacred places like the pyramids, the Taj Mahal, Machu Picchu, and I like to go there on a full moon. So this is the morning after the full moon. Often in this particular area in Cairo, Giza, in the winter there's a fog. I had spent the night up on one of the pyramids. I had gained special permission. And this is after I've walked back to my car and I cast a look over my shoulder for one more time and saw this amazing sort of mist burning off and photographing the pyramids. I am publishing a book that will be out later this year on sacred places and sacred landscapes. And I'm fascinated with these powerful, powerful places on the planet that draw such energy. Had the opportunity to go to an ancient salt mine in northern Mali for National Geographic. We put together an NPR radio expedition, had a movie and an article in the National Geographic Traveler of this ancient salt mine that's some 500 miles north of Timbuktu. And we would journey by camel every day, and this is our guide in the morning, would often go up and look from the sand dunes and be able to chart our journey, because he did not have a compass, we didn't have GPS, we were completely relying on this ancient tradition of them using celestial navigation, charting by the stars at night and the shadows and the patterns of the sand dunes during the day. I love Africa. My father is South African, and I've spent a lot of time documenting many of these power places. This is in Mali. This is right near Timbuktu, and this is a gentleman awaiting to go into the mosque on a Friday midday. And West Africa is probably the epicenter of many of the masks that are so common in the museums in New York and Germany. These powerful, powerful masks, specifically right in the center of Burkina Faso. This is a bull mask. The image before was a butterfly mask, and often they would have these rituals that would go on for days and days and days, and the opportunity to be able to document many of these traditions that are highly, highly threatened. We did a documentary, a film documentary at National Geographic, The Origins of Voodoo, and Wade Davis, my associate, wrote a book on the origins of voodoo, and so much of this area on Benin and Togo along the coast is the epicenter of voodoo. And of course, as the slaves were captured, brought over to the Caribbean and different parts of southern United States, that's how voodoo expanded over into specifically Haiti in the Caribbean. So the way I like to work, as I mentioned, is to spend enough time in the place where people know my trust and begin to trust me and work with them. And I always feel the quality of the portrait is in direct proportion to the quality of the relationship you create with the people. So I dedicate long periods of time, often months, to be able to build up a level of trust with my subjects. Many of these masks have never been photographed before, and for me that was so important in doing this mask project, is to be able to document some of these very, very rare mask rituals. And this particular area in central Burkina Faso is quickly changing. So many of the children, the adults are migrating to the city. So over the last 20 to 30 years I've been photographing, I've seen the catastrophic loss of many of these traditions. This is in Mali, the Dogon. And what's unique about this particular mask, it's called the Sergei mask. It is the young initiates that wear this mask, And that mask is probably some 20, 25 feet high. He's holding the mask in his teeth. It is not tied to his head. And so his initiation ritual is to dance back and forth with this mask. And for that period of time, he is the conduit between the celestial world and the earthly world, receiving, in a way like an antenna, the messages from the gods. So, after so many years of traveling overseas, I wanted to return to the Southwest Desert. I wanted to loop back again and complete the journey. So I now live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is one of the great areas for traditional Native American rituals. And literally 5 miles from where I live is a particular pueblo, and have these incredible rituals and dances that still exist. And so I'm working on a long-term project of working with different Native communities. This is the black buffalo mask. This is the white buffalo mask. And often, especially in Native American culture, there's a lot of misunderstanding and lack of trust. So again, it takes long periods of time of not even taking my camera into the community and building up relationships and building that level of trust, and then you know when it's time to photograph. I'm Canadian. I love Canada, and some of the most amazing costumes are on the northwest coast with the Tlingit and the Haida. And so there's a little island at the northern end of Vancouver Island called Alert Bay. And what's remarkable is this community has single-handedly revitalized the potlatch tradition, which is a very complicated, ritualized tradition of sharing wealth with the community. And during these potlatches, they had these remarkable costumes that relate to the wildlife around in both the ocean and in the forest. What's remarkable about this culture is that the tradition of potlatch was made illegal in the early 20th century. Many of their prized masks were stolen, taken, ended up in the Smithsonian, ended up in many collections around the world, and they have been working very hard to have them repatriated, and they've done this. So their community center there is quite remarkable. They have over 200 masks that some are 100, 150 years old. This is the raven mask. One of the young men that I hired as a model to be able to photograph these masks had talked about his brother. And he said his brother was the head of the clan, the Bear Clan. And he talked about how his brother committed suicide several years later, and not sure what just happened there. There. Excuse me. And he said, I now am the head of the Bear Clan, and I have this amazing bear mask. And I said, would you mind if I photographed it? And the backstory to this is I had spent about 10 years trying to track down this particular costume. And so it was an incredible privilege for him to wear this and to be able to photograph it. This is the sea monster mask. And again, they wear these in these incredible potlatch traditions. The orca mask. And again, these are the totems, these are the costumes, these are the animals that they worship, they understand, that are intricately woven into their survival and their culture. So, one of the last photographs that I took for my project was Gene the Raven Dancer, and I mentioned him the other day. And we continue to have a remarkable, amazing friendship. He goes into Native American communities and helps connect the youth to their culture as a part of a revitalization of the importance of the dance rituals. And after we created this photograph together, we were walking back to the car and he said to me, you know, we need to re-indigenize ourselves. We need to reconnect with our hearts and our minds and walk towards our ancestors. And I think that is so crucial for us here at the 21st century. If we're not careful, we will disconnect from who we are and our indigenous self. And he referred to walking back towards the ancestors. And I think that is so important at this point in our existence. So I just wanted to wrap up and say a little bit about our foundation. Again, we work at the crossroads of protecting not only indigenous knowledge, but the forest. Science has now proven that where given the opportunity, traditional cultures can help revitalize the biodiversity, help preserve the biodiversity. Coming out of COP26, one of the big efforts that we'll hear more and more about is 30 by 30, 30% of the planet by 2030. And certainly Brian and David and Kathy talked about this initiative that National Geographic is involved in terms of helping preserve 30% of the planet. And what we do is to ensure where there are indigenous communities that want to preserve their culture, to give them the opportunity, to give them the tools to be able to be a part of saving the forest, doing reforestation, and ultimately protecting their land. And as the world moves towards the 30 by 30 and creating national parks, more national parks, it's imperative that indigenous people are involved in that story and allowed to use their knowledge to be a part of the solution of the climate issues that we face into the future. Thank you very much.